In 1890, William James wrote that consciousness was not a chain or a train but a stream, continuously flowing, never truly broken, carrying within it both the bright objects of focal attention and the vast, dimly lit fringe of peripheral feeling and association that gives every thought its distinctive atmosphere. He was making a psychological claim about the nature of mental life. He was also, without quite knowing it, handing the writers of the following generation a new instrument for their art. The connection between James's stream of consciousness and the literary technique that goes by the same name is direct but not simple. Virginia Woolf, who was shaped by a philosophical culture deeply influenced by James's work, did not adapt his theory mechanically. She was not illustrating a psychological thesis. She was doing something that the psychological observation made possible. She was trying to capture in prose the actual texture of conscious experience, the way the mind moves through time, the way past and present interpenetrate, the way perception and memory and association flow together in a way that conventional narrative, with its orderly sequence of events, could not convey. To read Mrs. Dalloway is to experience something very like what James was describing. Clarissa's mind moves through her morning in a way that is simultaneously present and full of the past. The smell of the air recalls her youth, a sound on the street recalls a person recalls a feeling that colors the entire scene she is walking through. The syntax itself bends and flows to accommodate this movement. Woolf's sentences do not proceed from point to point like entries in a ledger. They radiate outward, then circle back, then deepen. This was a new way of making meaning in prose, and it was not possible without the intellectual preparation that James's psychology had provided. James Joyce was equally influenced, though his use of stream of consciousness technique was more extreme and less immediately grounded in the philosophical tradition. Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake pushed the representation of inner experience to limits that even James would probably have found disorienting. But the underlying conviction that ordinary consciousness, with its associations, its non sequiturs, its sudden depths and its comic deflations, was the proper subject of serious literary art, that conviction came from the cultural atmosphere that James had helped create. Marcel Proust in France was working from a somewhat different philosophical tradition, closer to Bergson than to James, but was engaged with the same fundamental problem: how to represent the way consciousness moves through time, how memory is not storage but reconstruction, how the past lives in the present in forms that no linear narrative can adequately capture. Bergson and James were themselves closely related thinkers, and the literary movements they inspired converged on similar formal solutions. It is worth pausing to appreciate how unusual this intellectual migration was. A technical concept from a psychology laboratory, a description of the structure of mental processes aimed at professional scientists, crossed the boundary between disciplines and became a formal principle in a completely different art form. This happened because the concept was true. It corresponded to something real about experience that artists, working to represent experience accurately, needed a language for. The truth of the psychological observation created the demand for the literary technique. James himself was not indifferent to literary quality. He wrote with unusual clarity and elegance for a philosopher, and he was deeply aware of the relationship between the form of expression and the content being expressed. His brother Henry was one of the greatest prose stylists in the English language. Growing up in the same household had given both brothers an education in what language could do when used with total commitment. William's prose in the Principles of Psychology does things that most scientific writing does not do. It creates an atmosphere, it inhabits its subject, it makes you feel what it is describing. The legacy of the stream of consciousness metaphor, in psychology, in literature, in cognitive science, in everyday language, is one of the most remarkable things about James's intellectual output. He gave us not just a theory but a way of talking about inner life that has shaped how 3 generations of writers, thinkers, and ordinary people understand what is happening inside them. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.